In a world absolutely overflowing with information, how do you cut through all the noise and get right to the core of what's truly important? It's often like standing at the edge of this massive, shimmering ocean of data, just wondering where to dive in to find the most illuminating insights that really matter to you.
It's a common challenge, isn't it? Information overload is real.
Hmm?
And it's precisely why understanding foundational frameworks, those underlying blueprints for how we think about knowledge, is so crucial. They give you the lens, the deep dive equipment, really, to make sense of everything else you encounter.
Exactly. And today we're embarking on a deep dive into positivism. Now, this isn't just some dusty, abstract philosophical term from a textbook. It's a foundational stance that has profoundly shaped how we understand knowledge itself, how we conduct science, and even how we structure human society. It's a concept that underpins so much of our modern inquiry, our daily news, and even our personal beliefs about what's true, yet surprisingly often, it's really misunderstood in its essence.
What's truly fascinating here is just how pervasive its influence has been over the last few centuries, subtly shaping our approach to everything from, say, medical research to economic policy. Even if the term positivism isn't always explicitly recognized in everyday conversation, it's kind of the water we swim in when we talk about objective facts.
To help us navigate this intricate intellectual landscape, we've pulled together a really rich stack of sources for you. We're looking at everything from rigorous academic papers on research paradigms and the philosophy of science to very specific, compelling applications in fields as diverse as economics, law, and even the intensely human-centered world of nursing.
Our mission today is crystal clear. We want to unpack the core meaning of positivism, trace its profound historical journey from its very origins, explore its enduring impact and practical applications across these diverse fields, and then critically examine its limitations, especially when we put it into conversation with its major philosophical counterpoint, interpretivism.
Get ready for some genuinely surprising facts and plenty of aha moments that will absolutely shortcut your path to being truly well-informed on this topic. It's going to be a fascinating journey. Let's dive in. Okay, let's start at the very beginning. Before we get too deep into positivism itself, we need to understand a foundational concept. What exactly is a research paradigm? Now, you're likely familiar with the idea of a paradigm shift, a big change in how we think about something. In research, a paradigm is similar. It's a foundational framework, a set of deep-seated beliefs and assumptions that essentially guides how researchers view the world and, crucially, how they then conduct their studies. Think of it as the ultimate blueprint, the guiding philosophy for how you seek, validate, and understand knowledge. It's the lens through which you frame every question and interpret every answer.
That's right. It's the underlying structure, almost like an invisible set of rules, that dictates what questions are even considered worth asking, what kind of data is considered valid, and even what methods are deemed appropriate for gathering that data. And these paradigms aren't just abstract ideas. They're composed of several key interconnected components that shape the entire research process.
First up, we have ontology. This term comes from philosophy, and it's concerned with the very nature of reality itself. It asks the fundamental questions. What exists? What is truly real? Is there one single objective reality out there that we can all agree on and measure, like the laws of physics? Or are there multiple subjective realities, each perceived and constructed differently by individuals, shaped by their experiences, cultures, and beliefs? It's a profound starting point for any inquiry, because your answer to this question profoundly influences everything that follows.
Yeah, it really does. If we connect this to the bigger picture, your ontological stance shapes your entire approach. If you believe there's one objective reality, you'll naturally look for universal laws that apply everywhere. You'd assume a phenomenon works the same way for everyone, everywhere. But if you believe in multiple subjective realities, you'll be far more interested in individual experiences, interpretations, and the nuances of how different people construct their understanding of the world. Think about how differently you'd approach a debate if you believed there was one absolute truth to uncover versus believing everyone's truth is valid and worthy of understanding. That's your ontology playing out right there.
Then there's epistemology. This delves into how that reality, however you define it, is known by the researcher. It's about how we uncover knowledge and, critically, what actually constitutes acceptable, legitimate knowledge. It also touches on how a researcher views the world and, in a way, distinguishes between what's right and wrong in the pursuit of understanding. It's essentially your theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Do we know it through observation, through reason, through experience, or maybe through personal insight?
And that raises an important question.
Right.
How does the researcher's perspective, their beliefs, their biases, influence what can be known? Different epistemological assumptions will lead to vastly different approaches to gaining knowledge. What counts as truth in one paradigm might be dismissed as mere opinion or, speculation in another. For instance, do you believe knowledge is something out there to be discovered objectively, or something in here, constructed through interaction and interpretation? That's epistemology.
Next, we have methodology. This refers to the overall research strategy you follow to conduct your study, and it flows directly from your ontological and epistemological assumptions. It outlines the general approach, the grand plan, and identifies the types of methods you'll use. Crucially, it focuses on the nature of the process itself, the logic behind your approach, rather than just the specific instruments you're going to wield. It's the how of your entire research journey.
Right. So methodology isn't just about picking a survey or an interview. It's the strategic roadmap for your research. It's the overarching plan that dictates how you will approach your investigation to align with your ontological beliefs about reality and your epistemological views on how knowledge is acquired. It's not just about what tools you use, but how you plan to use them to systematically construct and validate knowledge in a way that's consistent with your underlying assumptions.
And finally, we have methods. These are the concrete, specific techniques used for data collection and analysis. We're talking about the nuts and bolts, things like surveys, controlled experiments, in-depth interviews, ethnographic observation, or complex statistical analysis. These are the tangible tools you employ in the field to gather and make sense of your data.
Exactly. And this is where the previous components truly become tangible and actionable. The specific methods chosen directly flow from the broader methodological strategy you've adopted. That strategy, in turn, is determined by your epistemological views on how knowledge is acquired, and ultimately by your ontological beliefs about the nature of reality. Understanding this entire chain, from your fundamental view of reality right down to the specific tools you use, is absolutely crucial for comprehending any research you encounter and for applying any theoretical framework effectively in the real world. It's the full life cycle of how knowledge is built.
So, with that essential foundation laid, let's turn our spotlight directly onto positivism, this fascinating quest for objective fact. At its heart, positivism is a philosophical stance that asserts that the only valid knowledge comes from sensory experience and empirical observation. It seeks facts without the influence of subjective theories, personal biases, or unobservable phenomena. It emphasizes that facts are collected through rigorous enumeration, precise measurement, or controlled experimentation, and it's all about sticking to what is directly observable, verifiable, and measurable.
What's profoundly important here is its core philosophical underpinning, a belief that the world, including human society, can only be truly known through observable entities. These entities are believed to operate with demonstrated regularities, governed by general, discoverable laws that can be verified through their precise measurement and quantification. This approach is often described as an analytical method based on strict logical empiricism, which is very much akin to what we traditionally think of as the scientific method, the kind applied in fields like, physics or chemistry.
And a key defining characteristic of positivism is its strong, almost uncompromising rejection of metaphysics, if you're wondering what that means. It fundamentally opposes any investigation procedures or forces that are not reducible to a scientific method or cannot be empirically verified. It seeks to eliminate abstract beliefs, speculative reasoning, or any non-observable elements like spirits, divine intervention, or even abstract moral principles from scientific inquiry altogether. For a positivist, if you can't measure it, see it, or test it, it's not part of valid scientific knowledge.
Right. This raises an important question. What does that boundary mean for how knowledge is acquired and what counts as genuine understanding? It means that if something cannot be precisely seen, heard, touched, measured, or rigorously experimented upon, it's considered outside the realm of legitimate scientific inquiry. This is a very clear and distinct boundary that limits the scope of what can be scientifically studied and asserted as true in a positivist sense. It prioritizes empirical evidence above all else.
Positivism can really be distilled into three basic, powerful principles. First, and perhaps most controversially, science is considered the only valid knowledge, and facts are the only possible objects of knowledge. It's a bold claim, isn't it? It elevates scientific methodology above all other forms of understanding.
Absolutely. This principle establishes a clear hierarchy of knowledge where scientific inquiry stands supreme. It suggests that any other form of knowing, whether it's through intuition, personal belief, spiritual insight, or even philosophical speculation not grounded in empirical data, is not truly valid or reliable in the pursuit of understanding reality. It's a very exclusive club for what counts as knowledge.
The second principle states that philosophy does not possess a method different from that of science. Essentially, philosophy, in this view, must adhere to the same empirical principles and rigorous methodology as scientific disciplines. It's a call for philosophical inquiry to be as structured, evidence-based, and verifiable as any scientific experiment. It's less about grand, untestable theories and more about analyzing the logic of scientific discovery itself.
Yeah, this is a significant point because it pushes philosophy away from abstract metaphysical speculation and towards a more data-driven empirical role. In this framework, philosophy's purpose becomes understanding the underlying principles and logic of scientific investigation, analyzing its methods and refining its language, rather than constructing vast, unprovable theoretical systems of its own. It sort of serves science, rather than standing apart from it.
And the third principle specifies that the primary task of philosophy is to find the general principles common to all sciences, thereby unifying knowledge under a single methodological umbrella. It's about finding the universal rules, the foundational logic that apply across disciplines, whether you're studying physics, biology, or human societies. It's a vision of a grand, unified science.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this principle aims to create a cohesive, integrated framework for all knowledge. It envisions commonalities and shared methodologies across seemingly disparate disciplines like physics, biology, and sociology, and seeks a unified, scientific approach to understanding the entire world. It's a powerful call for intellectual integration, believing that one scientific method can unlock all truths.
Now, within this fascinating framework, we also encounter what's sometimes called the law of positivism, or historical positivism. This informs the search for scientific laws by rigorously cataloging and analyzing facts without concern for their theoretical implications or what they might mean for the future. It's a focus on pure description, on the what is, based on observable historical data. This contrasts quite sharply with historicism, which aims not just to describe events, but to show how they logically follow one another according to some presumed, often overarching general law of history, suggesting a predictable pattern.
Right. So historical positivism is truly about the raw, verifiable data, the what happened that we can empirically confirm. It meticulously records and analyzes events as they occurred without imposing a grand narrative or predictive theory. Historicism, on the other hand, tries to impose a why or a predictive pattern on historical events, suggesting an inherent direction or destiny. It highlights positivism's core dedication to observable facts above all else, keeping theoretical speculation firmly separate from the data collection itself.
Here's where it gets really interesting as we trace the deep roots of positivism and its unexpected origins. The term positivism itself, believe it or not, dates back to the early 19th century, coined by none other than the French philosopher Auguste Comte. He initially launched it in the form of scientific positivism, envisioning a society built entirely on scientific principles. But here's a twist. Later in his life, he actually reoriented his vision, moving it towards a new law of humanity, with its own rather ambitious religion of humanity, complete with rituals and saints. It was a fascinating and some might say eccentric evolution of his ideas.
It really was. What's truly captivating here is Comte's utopian vision. He wasn't just describing a philosophical approach to knowledge. He was advocating for a complete societal reordering, a grand reform based entirely on scientific principles. He proposed a very specific hierarchical classification of the sciences, believing they progressed from the most fundamental and abstract to the most complex and applied. This hierarchy started with mathematics.
The foundation.
Exactly. Then moved to astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and at the very top, culminated in sociology, which he saw as the ultimate science, the queen of sciences, capable of understanding and organizing human society itself.
And the placement of each science in this hierarchy wasn't arbitrary at all. It depended on a set of criteria he meticulously laid out, including the degree of accuracy and precision achievable, the level of objectivity, their historical priority.
Which sciences developed first?
Right, and their certainty. The idea was that as you moved up the ladder, so in Comte's view, more foundational to understanding human society and guiding its progress.
But here's a truly surprising fact that often catches people off guard, especially given how economic inquiry is pursued today. Comte denied economics a place in this sacred scientific hierarchy. He believed it simply did not meet his rigorous criteria for scientific inquiry because, in his view, economic facts could not be isolated from the intimate solidarity of the social organism. They were too intertwined with human emotions, values, and the complex web of social relations to be fully researched using his strict positive method of pure observation, detached experience, and precise measurement. He felt economic phenomena were too inherently messy and human to be reduced to strict predictable laws like physics.
That's a truly counterintuitive exclusion, isn't it? Especially considering how incredibly scientific and data-driven economics has become in the modern era. And Comte also famously developed his foundational concept of societal progress through what he called the law of three stages. First, the theological stage, where human understanding attributes destiny and events to divine powers or supernatural forces.
The age of gods, essentially.
Then the metaphysical stage, where abstract terms and philosophical concepts replace divine explanations, moving towards more abstract reasoning but still without empirical grounding.
Like replacing gods with nature or reason.
Exactly. And finally, the positive stage, where humans recognize themselves as part of nature, discard supernatural and abstract explanations, and instead operate under discoverable social laws of cause and effect based purely on observation and empirical evidence.
This law of three stages was absolutely central to his vision of human intellectual development, culminating, he believed, in a society governed by these very scientific principles and positive knowledge. It's a grand narrative of human intellectual evolution, a historical trajectory where humanity progressively sheds superstition and abstract speculation in favor of empirical, verifiable knowledge. It's a profound statement about the inevitable march towards scientific understanding.
Moving forward into the early 20th century, we see the rise of logical positivism, which represents a significant epistemological school rooted deeply in European philosophical empiricism, much like Comte's work, but with maybe a new level of rigor. Its main aim was incredibly ambitious: to identify the extent to which any piece of knowledge actually has genuine scientific meaning, and, just as importantly, to discard anything that didn't meet that strict standard. It was all about precision, logical rigor, and verification.
This approach was championed by a highly influential group of thinkers, known as the Vienna Circle, who gathered around figures like Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead. They were fiercely committed to the idea that the path to true knowledge involved meticulous measurements, precise counting of items, and rigorous statistical analysis. For them, if a statement couldn't be logically derived or empirically verified, it was, quite simply, meaningless in a scientific sense.
They introduced the absolutely crucial concept of cognitive significance. According to logical positivists, only two types of statements are considered scientifically meaningful, truly worthy of intellectual consideration. First, analytic statements, which are essentially tautologies or self-contradictions that are true purely by definition. Think of something like, all bachelors are unmarried men, or a triangle has three sides. These are true because of the very meaning of the words, and they're found in any rigorous scientific language. They don't tell you anything new about the world, but they define its terms.
Right, true by definition. And second, synthetic statements. These are assumptions or propositions related to facts that make claims about the world and, crucially, can be verified through empirical observation. For example, the sky is blue, or water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. These are statements whose truth value depends on how the world actually is, and they can be tested through direct experience.
So here's the kicker, and this is where logical positivism really drew a line in the sand. Any other statements that don't fall neatly into these two categories are considered metaphysical, factually meaningless, and entirely outside the realm of scientific method. This is true even if they describe what might seem like significant daily behaviors, moral judgments, or profound spiritual insights. For the logical positivists, if it wasn't analytic or empirically verifiable, it was, in a scientific sense, just noise.
Indeed. This effectively dismisses vast areas of philosophical speculation, ethical discourse, aesthetic judgments, or even subjective human experiences as unscientific or cognitively meaningless. This raises an important question. Given such a strict filter, what were the precise criteria logical positivists actually used to determine if a statement was valid and held scientific meaning?
They had three main criteria that formed their intellectual sieve. First is the statement self-evident. This means it's true simply by virtue of its logical form or the definitions of its terms, like a square has four sides.
Okay, analytic again, basically.
Pretty much. Second, does the statement follow logically from other known truths, adhering to strict rules of formal logic? This is about deductive reasoning, where conclusions are guaranteed if the premises are true.
Logical deduction.
Right. And third, and perhaps most defining, can the statement be proven or disproven through direct observation? This involves a rigorous process of measuring, observing, recording, classifying, and analyzing real-life empirical data. If a statement couldn't pass one of these three tests, it was relegated to the realm of the meaningless.
The impact of logical positivism, despite its later critiques and eventual decline as a dominant school, is undeniable. Its insistence on rigor and empirical verification contributed significantly to the development of what are known as hypothetico-deductive models, the very bedrock of modern scientific inquiry, where you form a testable hypothesis and then rigorously try to prove or disprove it through observation and experiment.
The scientific method as many learn it.
Exactly. It also shaped nomologico-deductive models, which aim to explain individual events by subsuming them under general laws. In essence, it fundamentally influenced how we distinguish genuine science from pseudoscience, setting clear criteria for scientific demarcation and profoundly shaping our understanding of the nature of scientific explanation itself. Its legacy, even amid later re-evaluations, is immense, having pushed science towards unprecedented levels of empirical rigor.
Let's transition now to how positivism, with all its emphasis on objectivity and empirical data, plays out in the real world, particularly in diverse fields. First up, its broad and widespread application in the social sciences and general research. The core belief here is that these disciplines studying complex human beings and societies should really emulate the hard natural sciences, like physics or chemistry, to study society. The idea is that human behavior, like physical phenomena, is governed by universal laws that can be discovered and measured.
This philosophical stance translates directly into the preferred research methods. Positivism strongly advocates for the use of quantitative research. This involves systematically measuring phenomena, counting items, collecting numerical data, and conducting extensive statistical analysis. The goal is to identify patterns of behavior, thought, and emotion that are believed to govern human actions, ultimately aiming to uncover generalizable laws or causal relationships that apply broadly across populations. You're looking for statistically significant trends.
So the ideal positivist research process in this context typically involves designing highly structured experiments or large-scale surveys, meticulously collecting that hard, quantifiable data, often from vast numbers of participants, and then analyzing this information using sophisticated statistical methods. The aim is to generate conclusions based purely on these numerical results, using statistics to eliminate as much researcher bias as possible, and thereby arrive at reliable, fact-based findings that can be generalized to a larger population. It's all about replicability and predictive power.
Indeed. Quantitative research within this positivist framework is often seen as the most objective and empirical method available for studying human phenomena. This is precisely because it allows for the measurement of things that might otherwise seem hard to quantify, like attitudes, opinions, or social trends, by assigning numerical values to them. By doing so, it brings a perceived scientific rigor to the study of social phenomena, focusing intently on what can be observed, counted, and statistically analyzed, ultimately aiming to develop universal social laws, much like laws of physics. It's about finding the underlying statistical regularities in the human world.
Now let's turn to economic positivism, and this is a truly fascinating historical trajectory, almost ironic given its origins. Despite Auguste Comte's initial and rather famous denial of economics as a true science, remember, he felt it couldn't isolate facts from the social organism. Economic positivism actually became incredibly pervasive and ultimately dominant in the field. What a twist of intellectual fate.
It is quite an irony, isn't it? The dominance of economic positivism is so profoundly embedded in how we understand and teach economics today that almost every introductory economics textbook begins by explaining the fundamental distinction between positive economics and normative economics. This foundational split is a direct inheritance of the positivist approach.
This distinction is a core concept you'll encounter in any economics course. Positive economics focuses strictly on what is. It aims to establish objective uniformities and describe economic phenomena as they exist, based purely on observable data, verifiable facts, and testable hypotheses. It seeks to explain and predict economic behavior without judgment. For example, an increase in the minimum wage leads to a decrease in employment. This is a positive statement, one that can, in theory, be tested.
Right? Testable, even if the results are debated. In contrast, normative economics is concerned with what ought to be. It deals with ideals, value judgments, ethical considerations, and policy recommendations. It moves beyond mere description to prescriptive statements. For instance, the government should increase the minimum wage to improve living standards. This is a normative statement, as it involves a value judgment about what's desirable. The distinction is crucial, and positivism firmly resides in the what is camp, attempting to keep economics a value-free science.
Let's see how various economics schools embraced or grappled with positivism because it wasn't a straightforward adoption. Take the Austrian approach, exemplified by Karl Menger, one of the founders of the Austrian School of Economics. While not purely positivist in the strict Comtean sense, it certainly introduced a rigorous scientific aspiration by distinguishing between sciences dealing with material nature,
which are known retrospectively through sensory experience, like physics,
and human nature, which Menger believed could be known a priori through introspection and understanding human action.
Interesting distinction. Menger emphasized understanding the human nature of economic phenomena and individual subjective valuations before trying to impose quantitative relations. He ferociously insisted that mathematics cannot help the economist find the quantitative essence of the phenomena, such as value, rent, and profit. He believed these were subjective and qualitative at their core. However, crucially, he still sought an empirical foundation for his exact or isolation method, trying to identify fundamental, universal laws of human action. So there's a deep desire for a scientific basis, even as not strictly positivist in the pure empirical measurement sense. He was searching for universal truths about human economic behavior.
Then there's eclectic positivism, as seen in the work of Alfred Marshall, a towering figure who synthesized classicism, the German historical school, and marginalism into his monumental principles of economics. He explicitly argued for economic analysis using empirical methods, stating that the fundamental role of science was to assemble, collate, analyze economic facts, and use knowledge obtained from observation and experience. He deeply believed in the power of data and careful observation.
Yes, but while Marshall's economic laws primarily aimed to show what is, reflecting a positivist inclination, he was also a pragmatist. He famously allowed for value judgments and normative considerations, particularly when he focused on economics' ability to solve practical problems and establish standards for guiding life. He was deeply concerned with the welfare of man in flesh and blood, rather than an abstract homo economicus or economic man. This reflects a less rigid adherence to pure positivism, acknowledging that economics at its best could inform policy and address real human issues. He wanted economics to be both a science and, well, a tool for social improvement.
Next, we have deductive positivism with Vilfredo Pareto, an Italian economist and sociologist. Pareto aimed for a purely deductive, non-ideological economics, explicitly striving for economics to be a science akin to physics. He even saw human society as a giant aggregate of molecules governed by forces and equilibria. He suggested that sciences like political economy, which cannot easily revert to experience in controlled lab settings, must be content to observe patterns in the real world and deduce principles from those observations.
Pareto conceptualized pure political economics as akin to physics or mathematics, providing a first approximation of phenomena and conditions for balance, much like models in physics. Applied political economics, he believed, would then draw from history and sociology to provide the concrete essence and context. He's widely considered a founder of an explicit positivist approach in economics, striving for a science emancipated from both morality and direct political influence, seeking universal, measurable laws of social and economic equilibrium.
And we absolutely cannot discuss economic positivism without talking about the monumental and enduring influence of Milton Friedman, particularly his seminal essays in Positive Economics from 1953. Friedman, famously quoting Marshall, argued that the ultimate goal of a positive science is the development of a theory or hypothesis that provides valid and meaningful predictions about yet unobserved phenomena. For Friedman, the test of a good economic theory wasn't necessarily the realism of its assumptions, but its predictive power.
That's a key point. Friedman saw theory as a blend of language, the conceptual framework, and hypotheses with empirical content, the testable predictions derived from that framework. He valued a theory almost exclusively based on its predictive power. Friedman's work essentially revived and formalized a Kantian vision within modern economics, emphasizing that the positive character of an economic theory consists in its ability to operate with statements derived from empirical observations that are confirmed in as many cases as possible, often through complex statistical and econometric techniques. So if your model could predict outcomes reliably, it was a good model, regardless of how neatly its assumptions map to reality. This view remains incredibly influential in macroeconomic modeling and policy today.
Let's shift gears now to legal positivism, a profoundly influential philosophy of law. Here, the core idea is that the existence and content of law depend entirely on social facts. What are social facts? They're things like acts of legislation, judicial decisions, customs, or official pronouncements, essentially, things that human beings have posited or created. This stands in sharp contrast with natural law theories, which argue for a necessary connection between law and morality, suggesting that for a law to be truly valid, it must also be morally just.
Right. The very etymology of positivism in this context is revealing. It derives from the Latin positus, meaning to place or to put. This implies that laws are literally posited or established by human beings, and it's this act of creation, this human authority, that makes them authoritative and binding. For a legal positivist, the merit of a law, whether it's fair or just, is entirely separate from its legal validity. A law may be morally wrong, even abhorrent, but still a perfectly valid law if it was properly enacted through the established legal procedures. Think about a tyrannical regime enacting a cruel law. A legal positivist would say it's a valid law because it was enacted through the recognized process, even if I despise its content.
We can trace the evolution of legal positivism through several key historical figures, each building upon or critiquing their predecessors. Starting with Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, in his seminal work Leviathan, he offered an early theory of law based on sovereign power. For Hobbes, law depended solely on the sovereign's will, and the purpose of law was to ensure social order and prevent chaos, regardless of its content or perceived injustice. Obedience to the sovereign's law was paramount for peace.
Then came Jeremy Bentham, arguably the greatest British legal positivist of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He developed a comprehensive theory of law as the expressed will of a sovereign, backed by sanctions. He famously distinguished between expositors, who merely explained the law as it was, and censors, who critically analyzed what the law ought to be. This separation was crucial for him. And in a memorable flourish, he famously rejected the concept of natural rights as nonsense upon stilts, arguing that rights could only exist if they were created and enforced by positive law.
Following in Bentham's footsteps was his student, John Austin, who developed what's known as the command theory of law. Austin defined law as commands issued by an uncommanded commander, meaning the sovereign, who is habitually obeyed by the majority and is not himself subject to any higher human authority, and these commands are enforced by sanctions. So a law is essentially an order from the top down, backed by a threat. He even accounted for non-sanctioned rules like contract law by proposing a sanction of nullity for failure to obey them, meaning if you break a contract, the agreement just becomes void, which is itself a kind of negative consequence.
Moving to the continent in the early 20th century, Hans Kelsen, an Austrian jurist, developed his pure theory of law. Kelsen's approach was radical because he viewed law as separate from both empirical facts and morals, striving for a truly pure science of law. He introduced the crucial concept of a norm as an ought statement, distinct from a factual is statement. For Kelsen, legal norms are coercive rules that form a hierarchical system. This system ultimately rests on a hypothetical, non-positive foundational concept he called the basic norm, Grundnorm, from which all other norms in the legal system derive their validity. Think of the Grundnorm as the ultimate, unspoken foundational rule of a legal system, perhaps. The Constitution must be obeyed. All other laws then get their authority from that ultimate basic norm.
In the mid-20th century, H.L.A. Hart, a leading British legal philosopher, became arguably the most influential legal positivist of his time, significantly critiquing Austin's simplistic command theory. Hart introduced crucial distinctions that reshaped legal philosophy, particularly between internal and external consideration of law.
How participants view rules versus how external observers see them.
Right, and most importantly, between primary rules, which govern conduct like criminal law or contract law, and secondary rules, which provide methods for recognizing, changing, or applying primary rules, such as rules of recognition, rules of change, and rules of adjudication. Hart famously argued that there is no necessary relation between law and morality. A law's validity doesn't depend on its moral content.
Hart's work was absolutely pivotal in modern legal philosophy, providing a much more sophisticated account of legal systems. And following Hart, his influential pupil, Joseph Raz, further developed legal positivism, most notably arguing, contrary to some of Hart's later more nuanced positions, for an exclusive view, that the validity of a law can never depend on its morality, only on its source. If a legal system seems to refer to morality, Raz argued, it's because it authorizes judges to use moral reasoning, not because morality constitutes the law's validity itself. This strongly reinforces the separation thesis.
This leads us to an important contemporary distinction within legal positivism: inclusive, soft legal positivism and exclusive, hard legal positivism. Both share two basic tenets: the social thesis, which asserts that law is a human creation determined by social facts, and the separation thesis, which states that law and morality are conceptually distinct. This means you can identify what law is without necessarily making a moral judgment about it.
Where they diverge is on how morality might potentially influence law's validity. Inclusive positivism allows for the possibility that a legal system's criteria for identifying valid laws, what Hart called this rule of recognition, may incorporate moral standards. So, for example, if a country's constitution explicitly requires all laws to respect human rights, then conformity with a moral principle, human rights, becomes a contingent, though not necessary, condition of legal validity for that specific system. It's an optional connection, not an inherent one.
But exclusive positivism maintains a stricter line. It argues that the validity of a law is never determined by its moral content, only by its source and formal procedures. If a constitution references moral principles, an exclusive positivist would interpret this not as incorporating morality directly into the law's validity criteria, but rather as authorizing judges to use moral reasoning to develop or modify the law. The moral reasoning is applied to the law, but it doesn't make the law valid. The validity comes solely from the source and proper enactment.
We can also briefly mention other useful classifications of legal positivism developed by Italian philosopher Roberto Bobbio. He identified methodological legal positivism, which is simply the value-free descriptive study of law as it is, theoretical legal positivism, which sees law as sovereign commands, forming a complete and coherent system, and ideological legal positivism, which is the normative theory that positive law, once identified as valid, ought to be obeyed regardless of its content. This illustrates the many layers and debates within this rich philosophical tradition, underscoring its complexity beyond a simple definition.
Shifting now to a very practical and intensely human-centered field, let's explore positivism in nursing. In advanced nursing practice, a strict, unadulterated positivist approach can lead to science becoming the sole or primary basis for patient care. This approach emphasizes objectivity, empirical evidence, and a laser focus on natural phenomena, like biological processes or disease mechanisms which are observable and measurable.
However, this often creates an inherent and significant tension with what nurses often refer to as the art of nursing. The strict application of objective scientific knowledge alone, without the inclusion of deeply humanistic principles, can be seen as profoundly dehumanizing for patients. It potentially leads to detachment and coldness in the relentless quest for objective scientific knowledge, inadvertently shifting patient care away from a holistic, person-centered approach that considers the patient's emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. It risks reducing a person to, well, a mere collection of symptoms and data points.
So what are the specific attributes of positivism when it's applied in a nursing context, recognizing this tension? First, there's the reliance on experience, meaning gaining knowledge through direct, repeatable observation and active participation in patient care. This involves systematic observation of symptoms, responses to treatments, and physical signs.
Then we have the use of a system of facts, or what we might call established theory. This involves utilizing established nursing theories or broader scientific knowledge, such as the complexity integration nursing theory, CINT, to guide assessments and interventions. CINT, for instance, helps nurses understand how various complex factors, from a patient's physical state to their psychological and social environment, interact and influence care, often leading to predictable patterns that can be observed and measured.
Objectivity is another key attribute. This means maintaining an unbiased perspective during patient assessment, relying strictly on observable facts and measurable conditions. Rather than allowing personal feelings, subjective interpretations, or prejudices to influence diagnosis or care plans, it's about sticking to the data. And, critically, empirical knowledge. This means applying knowledge gained from rigorous testing and verifiable experience, such as evidence-based practices like meticulous hand hygiene. These practices are supported by robust scientific studies, like the groundbreaking work of Joseph Lister in antiseptic surgery, or contemporary studies by researchers like Godoy et al. That demonstrate the effectiveness of hand washing in preventing the spread of infections like influenza. It's about implementing practices proven to work. The attribute of human is also acknowledged within this framework, but in a specific way. Recognizing the roles of both the advanced practice nurse, APN, and the patient as human beings within the healthcare encounter. However, the positivist lens tends to treat them as objects of study, albeit human ones, whose behaviors and physiological responses can be observed and categorized.
And finally, natural phenomena. This involves understanding the biological and physical events at play within the human body and its environment. For instance, understanding the existence and transfer of bacteria, the very foundation of germ theory, which are assessed scientifically through observable, measurable means. It's about applying biological and physical laws to the human body.
The critical insight emerging from nursing literature, though, is that while positivism offers undeniable methodological benefits, such as providing observable, quantifiable evidence for improved techniques and establishing best practices, advanced nursing practice must integrate this scientific, evidence-based approach with what's known as the art of nursing and a more humanistic, person-centered approach.
Absolutely. This means balancing systematic, logical, and evidence-based care with empathy, intuition, a deep understanding of individual patient experiences, and a recognition of the patient as a whole person, not just a set of symptoms or a data point. It's about consciously bridging the perceived division between the art and science of the discipline to provide truly comprehensive, compassionate, and effective care. It's the difference between treating a disease and caring for a person.
Now, as insightful and profoundly influential as positivism has been, it's certainly not without its critiques and limitations, especially when applied to the complexities of human beings and social phenomena. One major criticism is reductionism. Critics argue that positivism tends to drastically oversimplify complex realities by reducing them to only measurable units or variables. This can lead to potentially missing the nuanced, multifaceted nature of human behavior, the intricate dynamics of social interactions, or even the richness of internal mental events. By trying to reduce them to simple cause and effect relationships or quantifiable components. Think of trying to understand an entire society by just looking at economic numbers or reducing complex human emotions to mere chemical reactions in the brain. It's seen as missing the forest for the trees.
This often leads directly to the neglect of context and intangibles. Positivism is frequently criticized for failing to fully capture crucial elements like individual intentions, deep-seated motivations, subtle cultural aspects, unique historical contexts, and other non-quantifiable factors that are absolutely crucial for a complete understanding of phenomena, particularly in the social sciences and humanities. By focusing solely on observable descriptive findings and the status quo, it can hinder the kind of in-depth, rich insight that truly explains why things happen or what they mean to the people involved. It tends to flatten out the human experience.
Another significant issue is the misuse and inherent limitations of generalization. The heavy reliance on statistical tests and large samples, while aiming for objectivity, can ironically lead to misinterpretation. If the wrong statistical test is chosen, or if the results are heavily dependent on an arbitrary sample size. Furthermore, findings derived from a specific, carefully controlled context may not be broadly generalizable to all situations or populations, leading to an incomplete understanding of individual actions, intentions, and subjective realities in diverse settings. What holds true in one lab or survey might not hold true for everyone, everywhere.
Yeah, and this also raises an important question about the ideal of pure objectivity, leading to the criticism of the illusion of pure objectivity and inevitable bias. Critics argue that the positivist ideal of value-free or completely impartial observation is fundamentally misguided, if not impossible. Every scientist or researcher, regardless of their discipline, is inherently influenced by their personal experience, their education, their unique cultural background, and the society they live in. These deeply ingrained factors invariably affect how research questions are framed, what data is deemed important, how that data is interpreted, and what conclusions are ultimately drawn. True, unadulterated impartiality in this view is an unattainable myth.
And in fields like law, legal positivism, despite its logical rigor, is often seen as normatively inert. What does that mean? It means that while legal positivism excels at identifying what the law is, that is, which rules count as valid law based on social facts, it does not inherently claim that those laws should be obeyed or that they hold any inherent moral value. A valid law, identified through positivist methods, may be morally unjust, undesirable, or even tyrannical. It provides a description of the legal system, but it offers no internal moral compass or endorsement of the law's content. It's a powerful tool for analysis, but not necessarily for ethical guidance.
In direct and powerful response to these critiques of positivism, a contrasting paradigm known as interpretivism emerged. It offers a fundamentally different subjective perspective on reality and knowledge, directly challenging many of positivism's core tenets and pushing for a deeper understanding of human experience.
What's fascinating here is its core beliefs, especially concerning the nature of reality. In interpretivism, ontology shifts dramatically. Reality is not seen as a single, objective, external truth waiting to be discovered. Instead, it's viewed as complex, rich, and profoundly socially constructed through culture, language, shared meanings, and individual interactions. It embraces the idea of multiple meanings, diverse interpretations, and coexisting realities, recognizing a continuous flux of processes, experiences, and practices rather than static, measurable facts. It's about how we collectively make sense of the world.
And its epistemology is equally distinct, standing in direct contrast to positivism. Knowledge in interpretivism is considered value-bound. This means that researchers are not detached observers. They are an inherent part of what is researched. Subjectivity is not just acknowledged, it's embraced as crucial. The researcher's interpretations, their empathy, and their ability to connect with the subjects of study are key to the knowledge contribution. This requires the researcher to be reflective about their own position, their biases, and their potential influence on the research process, making transparency about perspective essential.
So, the methodological approach of interpretivism naturally gravitates towards qualitative methods, which are designed to capture that rich subjective understanding. It typically uses smaller samples but employs in-depth investigations, moving beyond numbers to narratives. It aims to gather richness and insights by focusing on stories, lived experiences, perceptions, meanings, and interpretations. Think about conducting long, in-depth interviews or immersing yourself in a particular cultural saga to truly understand its dynamics from the inside.
Exactly. Its fundamental purpose, unlike positivism's goal of generalization and the development of universal laws, is to provide a specific, deep, and nuanced understanding of a particular phenomenon based on the lived experiences and perceptions of those involved. It doesn't aim to generalize to broad populations, but to provide profound insight into a specific context. It fundamentally acknowledges that human beings, with their rich inner worlds and complex social interactions, cannot be explored and understood in the same way as inert physical phenomena. You can't just measure a person's happiness with a single number. You need to understand their story.
There are also several fascinating variations within interpretivism, each offering a slightly different lens for understanding subjective realities. For instance, hermeneutics is deeply focused on interpretation and understanding, especially of texts, whether those are written documents, cultural practices, or even social actions seeking to uncover the hidden meanings and intentions. It's like being a detective of meaning.
Right. Then there's phenomenology, which seeks to understand the world through the direct experiencing of phenomena. It's about grasping lived experience in its purest form, trying to understand what it's truly like to experience something from the perspective of the individual. It's less about external observation and more about internal, felt reality.
And symbolic interactionism, which considers how symbols, from words to gestures to objects, act as social objects that provide shared meaning, and how these shared meanings, in turn, construct our social reality. These variations collectively underscore interpretivism's profound focus on subjective meaning-making and the richness of human experience.
This brings us to what some scholars refer to as the great divide between these two powerful paradigms. Positivism generally aims for statistical reliance, broad generalization, and the development of universal objective laws, typically employing quantitative methods and large data sets. Interpretivism, on the other hand, seeks further depth and nuance through understanding the subjective experiences and perceptions within a particular social or human context, primarily using qualitative methods and smaller, more focused samples.
It's an ongoing, vibrant debate in academia and beyond. But what's interesting is the emergence of post-positivism. This movement represents an attempt to move beyond the strict dichotomy, acknowledging the inherent limitations of pure positivism, such as the difficulty of achieving absolute objectivity or fully capturing human complexity, and suggesting approaches that incorporate context, multiple viewpoints, and sometimes even mixed methods, combining both quantitative and qualitative techniques. It's a recognition that perhaps neither alone is sufficient for all questions.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's not truly about which paradigm, positivism or interpretivism, is inherently better in an absolute sense. That's a wrong question to ask. Rather, the choice of paradigm depends entirely on the fitness of each approach, the specific nature and context of your research question. What kind of knowledge you're trying to produce? Are you looking for broad, measurable trends or deep contextualized understanding? Your question should guide your method.
This raises an important question for all of us. Can they actually work together? In many practical fields, particularly those involving human experience like nursing, the most effective and insightful approach may actually involve integrating aspects of both. As we saw in nursing, combining positivism's scientific rigor and evidence-based methods with interpretivism's humanistic, person-centered approach can lead to a more thoroughly educated, compassionate, and truly effective practice, consciously bridging that division between the art and science of the discipline. It's about being both data-driven and deeply empathetic. We've journeyed through the intricate landscape of positivism today, tracing its history from Auguste Comte's initial ambitious vision to its profound influence across fields like economics, where it surprisingly became dominant, and in law, where it defines how we understand the very nature of legal validity, and even in nursing, where it grapples with the delicate balance between science and the human touch. We've explored its core tenets of objective, empirical inquiry and contrasted it with the rich, subjective lens of interpretivism.
What stands out, after all this, is that the choice between a positivist and an interpretivist approach isn't about choosing right or wrong, or one being definitively superior to the other. Instead, it's about understanding the unique kinds of questions each paradigm is designed to answer, and the distinct kind of knowledge each can uniquely uncover. They offer different, yet equally valuable lenses through which to view the world.
Absolutely. So consider this provocative thought for your own life and work. How might embracing both the objective, data-driven what is of positivism and the nuanced, human-centered why it matters of interpretivism not just enhance your understanding of the complex world around you, but also enrich your personal and professional decision-making? What aspects of your own life or work could truly benefit from a more positive, evidence-based analysis focusing on measurable facts and observable trends? And where might a deeper, more interpretive understanding of experiences, perspectives, and human stories be absolutely paramount? The most profound insights often lie at the intersection of these two powerful ways of knowing.